For 30 years, he carried a burden no one would have expected from a man who seemed to have everything. While the world saw the polished host, the charismatic entertainer, and the effortless humor that lit up millions of homes, behind the scenes he lived under a pressure that few could ever imagine. His smile became his shield, a carefully crafted mask he wore night after night, even when exhaustion pressed against his bones. Every evening as the cameras captured his jokes and his easy charm, he felt the weight of an unspoken truth building inside him. He knew that when the show ended, when the crowd stopped laughing, and when the studio lights blinked off, he would return to a life far different from the glamorous world people assumed he lived in. It was a life rooted not in fame but in fear. Specifically, the fear that one misstep, one failed season, one shift in the industry could send everything crashing down. Growing up with hardship had left a mark on him so deep it followed him into success like a shadow he could never outrun. And so, while everyone else believed he was living large, basking in wealth and recognition, he was living a different life entirely. Every night after the show, he followed the same quiet routine. He would slip out the back exit of the studio, avoiding fanfare, avoiding attention, avoiding anything that reminded him of the fragile pedestal he stood on. He drove himself home, alone, often replaying the events of the night not with pride but with scrutiny, analyzing every joke, every moment, every reaction, terrified that one mistake might cost him everything he had built. But that was only the beginning of his hidden life. What the world never saw was what he did once he arrived home. While Hollywood slept, he worked, silently, tirelessly, as if he were still the young man trying to survive his early days of grinding through clubs and barely making rent. He refused to spend the money he earned from television, convinced that fame was temporary and danger was always one step behind. Instead, he lived off his stand-up income, hoarded every paycheck, saved obsessively, and kept himself anchored to the same discipline he had developed in the days when one missed gig meant hunger. This was the double life he lived, the public figure adored for his confidence, and the private man driven by fear, discipline, and a relentless need to protect himself from a future he believed could collapse at any moment. For 3 decades, he held those two identities together, balancing on a tightrope that no one else even knew existed. And every night he returned to that fear, carrying it in silence, never letting the world see how heavy it truly was. Late-night viewers saw him disappear behind the curtains with a wave and a smile, but what they never knew was that his nights didn't end where the cameras stopped rolling. For years, decades even, he slipped away into the shadows, vanishing from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood into a life that looked nothing like the one people imagined. There were nights when the staff wondered where he went, nights when even close friends couldn't reach him, nights when rumors spread because no one could explain his sudden absence. But the truth was far stranger, far quieter, and far more revealing than any scandal could ever be. He would leave the studio through an unmarked door, often still wearing his stage clothes, and venture out into the city alone. No limousine, no entourage, no paparazzi escort, just him, a man who spent his days as a star and his nights as something completely different. He wasn't going to parties. He wasn't indulging in Hollywood excess. Instead, he was heading into places most celebrities never set foot in: small workshops, midnight garages, side streets where he could be anonymous for a few hours. This ritual became his escape, his grounding, the place where the performer melted away and the real man emerged. As the city slept, he immersed himself in the world he loved long before fame ever found him. Engines, metal, grease, the hum of machines being brought back to life. He wasn't just tinkering, he wasn't just fixing. He was rebuilding pieces of himself that the spotlight slowly chipped away. In those quiet garages, he didn't have to be funny. He didn't have to impress anyone. He didn't have to carry the weight of millions of expectations on his shoulders. He could breathe. He could think. He could exist without being watched. And yet, he never told anyone why he needed this hidden world so desperately. For nearly 30 years, he kept these nighttime journeys a secret, guarding them fiercely. He said it was a hobby, but it was much deeper than that. It was the only place where he felt truly alive. There were rumors, whispers, speculation about why he disappeared for hours after every show. Some thought he was networking, others thought he was struggling in silence. No one imagined the truth. He needed these late-night escapes to keep himself from unraveling under the pressure of being Jay Leno every waking moment. And as the years went on, the line between the public entertainer and the private man grew wider, deeper, harder to bridge. His mysterious disappearances weren't scandalous. They were survival, a double life he lived because the spotlight was too bright, too loud, too demanding to carry without a place to hide in the darkness. It happened during one of those quiet moments backstage, the kind no audience ever sees and no camera ever captures. The show had ended, the applause had faded, and the crew was busy wrapping cables and shutting down equipment. He sat alone in his dressing room, still wearing the same smile he had delivered on stage, but the moment the door clicked shut, that smile collapsed into something far more fragile. For years he had been the rock, the reliable laugh, the man who never cracked under pressure, but on this night, while staring into the mirror framed with harsh dressing room lights, he felt something shift inside him. A heaviness pressing against his chest, a truth he had swallowed for decades suddenly clawing its way to the surface. When a longtime friend knocked gently and stepped inside, they didn't find the confident performer the world adored. They found a man slumped forward, elbows on his knees, running a trembling hand across his face. The friend asked him softly if he was all right. For a moment, he tried to answer with a joke, because humor had always been his armor, but this time the joke didn't come. Instead, a silence settled between them, the kind that reveals everything without a single word being spoken. He looked up, eyes tired in a way makeup could never hide, and whispered something that stunned the friend who had known him for decades. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore." The friend stared at him, speechless. He explained, haltingly, vulnerably, that he had spent so long being the comedian, the host, the unstoppable workhorse, that he didn't know where that persona ended and where the real man began. He admitted he felt trapped between two identities, the one the world celebrated and the one that quietly unraveled behind closed doors. He confessed that the pressure to always be funny, always be cheerful, always be on had become suffocating, especially because deep down, he knew the laughter he gave others was not the laughter he felt inside. He spoke about nights sitting alone in his garage, surrounded by engines and silence, trying to remember who he was before fame shaped him into something larger than life. He talked about the exhaustion, not physical, but emotional, that came from carrying millions of strangers' expectations on his back. And then he admitted something he had never said aloud, that sometimes he feared the world loved the entertainer so much they would never accept the human behind him. His friend listened, heart sinking, realizing that beneath the jokes and the charm, he had been quietly drowning in a double life of his own making, one filled with applause and one filled with questions he no longer knew how to answer. That confession didn't just reveal a hidden struggle. It exposed the heartbreaking truth about living as two different people for 30 years. Eventually, one of them starts to fall apart. He always called it just a garage, a humble space tucked behind his home. But anyone who ever stepped inside knew it was far more than that. It was a world of steel, engines, oil-scented air, and stories buried beneath layers of dust. To the public, it was a collection, impressive, legendary, enviable. But to him, it was something deeper, a sanctuary, a refuge, a place where the weight of fame slipped off his shoulders and the quieter truth of who he really was finally had room to breathe. For decades, people assumed the garage was simply a playground for a man who loved cars. But what no one realized was how much of his soul he had tucked away among those machines. Late at night, when he escaped into the darkness after a show, it was this place he always ended up in. A place with no audience, no laughter, no pressure to perform. And inside that garage was something no one expected. A project he had hidden for years, a car he had been working on piece by piece. Slowly, obsessively, as if its restoration were tied to something inside him. The discovery came by accident. A producer who had come over for a meeting arrived early and wandered into the garage looking for him, and what he saw stopped him in his tracks. Tucked in the corner beneath a tarp was a vehicle that didn't match the polished perfection of the others. It was old, rusted, worn, a car most people would consider beyond saving. But when the producer pulled back the tarp slightly, he saw something that made the breath catch in his chest. A handwritten note taped to the dashboard, a note written decades ago, yellowed with time, addressed to himself during the early days of struggle. It read, "Fix this when you fix your life." The producer froze, realizing he had stumbled onto something deeply personal, a secret connected not to fame or fortune, but to the young man Jay once was, the man who was terrified of failing, terrified of going broke, terrified that success was temporary and collapse was permanent. A moment later, Jay entered the garage and saw the producer standing near the car. His expression changed instantly. Not anger, not embarrassment, something else. A vulnerability rarely seen in the man whose life had become synonymous with humor and confidence. He walked over slowly, pulled the tarp back fully, and for the first time, someone other than himself saw the hidden truth. This wasn't just a car. It was a reminder of where he came from. A symbol of every fear he had carried into success. A physical representation of a life he had lived quietly alongside the public one. He explained, voice softer than usual, that he kept the project secret because it grounded him. It reminded him that no matter how famous he became, he was still the kid who grew up with nothing. The kid who worked 2 jobs, the kid who repaired broken things with his hands because no one else would, the kid who feared losing everything even when he finally had it all. Seeing that unfinished car, untouched by cameras or crowds, revealed the part of his double life that had stayed hidden longest, the emotional tether to a past he never truly escaped. And in that moment, the truth became undeniable. His garage wasn't just a collection of cars, it was a collection of the pieces of himself he never let the world see. For years, people admired his discipline without ever understanding its origin. They praised his frugality, called it admirable, even quirky. A billionaire who never touched his television salary, a superstar who lived off comedy club earnings like a man still clawing his way up. But behind that discipline was a secret far heavier than simple financial caution. It was a habit born from fear, rooted in childhood memories that never left him. Long before fame, long before the cameras, he grew up in a household where money was never guaranteed. He remembered nights when bills piled up on the kitchen table like unwelcome guests, moments when the sound of overdue notices arriving in the mail made the air in the room tighten. He remembered the tension in his parents' voices, the quiet arguments about how to stretch what little they had, the lingering dread that tomorrow might be worse. Those memories imprinted themselves onto him in ways he never truly escaped. So when success finally came, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt terrified, terrified that it could disappear, terrified that he could wake up one day and find himself right back where he started. His secret financial life was built around that fear. He saved compulsively, obsessively, quietly, not because he loved money, but because he was preparing for disaster, planning for a collapse only he could see coming. While the world viewed him as untouchable, invincible, secure, he still lived like the young man who feared eviction notices. He refused to buy anything extravagant for himself unless he could justify it through hard work. And even then, guilt sometimes crept in, whispering that enjoyment was dangerous, that comfort could be taken away if he let himself rely on it. His friends and colleagues believed he was simply humble, but the truth was far more complicated. He was protecting himself from a life he had escaped physically but continued to live emotionally. And then, one night, while sitting with a longtime friend, that truth finally spilled out. They had been laughing over old stories when the conversation shifted, unexpectedly, to money, success, security, legacy. His friend joked about how he must feel invincible with everything he had achieved, but instead of laughing along, he grew quiet. He looked down at his hands and admitted something he had never said aloud. I saved because I'm still afraid. Afraid it could all disappear. Afraid I could lose everything. Afraid I'll never outrun where I came from. The friend stared at him, stunned, realizing for the first time that the life Jay Leno built, the success, the discipline, the relentless work ethic, wasn't about luxury or ego, it was about survival. It was about a man who spent 30 years preparing for an emergency that never came, living a double life between the comedian everyone adored and the boy who never fully healed from the fear of poverty. When the truth finally emerged, it didn't arrive through scandal, gossip, or a dramatic confession on live television. It surfaced slowly, quietly, almost accidentally, through a string of moments that revealed more than he ever intended to share. A friend let slip a detail here. A producer mentioned something small there. A late-night interview caught a flicker of honesty he couldn't quite mask. Piece by piece, the world began to see the cracks in the persona he had worn for so long. Not flaws, but glimpses of the human being behind the legend. And as those pieces came together, the public realized something they had never fully understood. The man who made a career out of making others laugh had been carrying a private world of fear, discipline, exhaustion, and emotional conflict that stretched across 3 decades. When he finally addressed it, he didn't dramatize it. He didn't embellish it. He simply spoke from a place of truth, sitting in a modest chair, surrounded by none of the glitz people associated with him. He explained that the double life he lived wasn't about deception, it was about survival. He talked about the invisible pressures of being always on, of living with the expectation that he must never crack, never falter, never reveal weakness. He shared that behind the smiles, there were nights he questioned who he was outside of the jokes, outside of fame, outside of the persona Hollywood crowned him with. He spoke about the loneliness that came with success, how crowds could cheer for him 1 second and disappear the moment he stepped off stage, leaving him to face the quiet battles alone. He admitted that the work routines, the late-night escapes, the obsessive saving habits, the emotional distance he sometimes carried weren't quirks or eccentricities. They were coping mechanisms for a fear he had never allowed himself to outgrow. His voice cracked as he revealed that there were years when he didn't feel like the man everyone believed him to be, years when the exhaustion felt heavier than the laughter was loud, years when the act of pretending seemed harder than performing the comedy itself. He spent so long living inside two identities, the comedian for the world and the survivor for himself, that there were nights he wondered if the divide would ever close. And then, with a sigh that seemed to release decades of unspoken truth, he said he finally understood something. He didn't need to hide anymore. He didn't need to hide anymore. He didn't need to carry the weight alone. As the world listened to his honesty, they didn't feel disappointment or betrayal. They felt empathy. They felt connection. They felt the quiet realization that even the biggest stars are human, fragile, complex, layered in ways that fame can never fully reveal. And in that moment, the double life he had lived for 30 years didn't make him smaller. It made him real. It made him relatable. It made him, for the first time in a long time, seen. This revelation revealed the deepest layer of that double life. Not fame versus anonymity, not comedian versus mechanic, but security versus fear. A silent battle fought every day, hidden behind laughter and engines, driving him harder than any audience ever could. In the end, the truth about his double life wasn't a scandal, it was a revelation, a reminder that even the brightest stars carry shadows the world never sees. For 30 years he lived between two worlds, the one filled with laughter, lights and applause, and the quiet one shaped by fear, discipline, and the relentless need to stay grounded. He wasn't hiding a secret to deceive anyone, he was hiding a struggle to survive himself. And when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't expose his weakness. It revealed his humanity. For the first time, people understood that the man who made millions laugh was also a man who worked tirelessly in silence, who saved obsessively out of fear, who rebuilt engines as a way of rebuilding his spirit, who created a sanctuary in his garage because the spotlight sometimes felt too heavy to stand under. They learned that beneath the jokes was someone carrying emotional weight few ever imagined, fighting battles he never allowed himself to express. And instead of falling from grace, he became more relatable, more admirable, more deeply respected than ever before, because the greatest twist of all wasn't the hidden life he lived. It was the strength it took to live it alone, to bear the pressure without breaking, to protect the world from his fears while giving them his best every single night. His journey became a quiet revelation that behind every smile is a story, behind every performer is a person, and behind every legend is a life far more complicated than the spotlight ever shows. And as he steps into the next chapter of his life, older, wiser, and finally free from the weight of that silent burden, one truth rises above everything else. He never lived a double life to deceive the world. He lived it to survive it. And now, after decades of carrying that hidden weight, he can finally breathe.